The second consequence, and it really does relate pretty closely to industrialization, the second consequence of this new pattern was an extension of European or Western military advantage from the seas to the land as well. Sea-based power remained crucial. This was the dominant source of Western military threat in the early modern period, and it obviously expands with better guns, larger ships, steamships, etc. But now a series of developments also opened up the possibility of land-based military dominance as well. These innovations included the development of smaller and more mobile field artillery, already used before industrialization outright, for example, by Napoleon in the French Revolutionary Wars. The developments included the early 19th century emergence of the repeating rifle and the possibility, which both British and American inventors helped develop, the possibility of producing this repeating rifle through the standardization of parts on a mass scale. Developments included, by the middle of the century, the emergence of early forms of the machine gun, i.e., these developments made it possible for small numbers of Western troops, sometimes literally a few score, to hold off sometimes several thousands, even tens of thousands of troops armed in more conventional fashion, as would occur in the European imperialist burst in Africa. Land-based military advantage was enhanced as well by transportation improvements. Steamships, and in a few cases railroads, allowed Westerners to ship troops and materiel long distances in fairly rapid order, and obviously the telegraph, by providing communication links as well, contributed here. Riverboats, steam-driven, now could plow upriver, which was critically important for European military penetration both of China and of Africa. And, though more in the later 19th century, the development of new tropical medicines added another ingredient that facilitated Western military interaction with key parts of the world. Add these two things together, and one has first a series of major crises in which the new Western military edge over other societies was demonstrated, crises that also quickly turned into larger patterns of economic exploitation as well. Event number one. 1798. Napoleon, briefly freed from much to do back in Europe, takes the French expeditionary force and invades Egypt, conquering Egypt fairly easily. He doesn't stay there because the British chase him out, but the ease with which European forces could conquer one of the heartland areas of the Islamic world was not lost on Egyptians or on the Ottomans more generally. They didn't quite know what to do about it, but the balance between European military authority and Middle Eastern military power had clearly been dramatically altered. Crisis number two, the First Opium War in China, 1839. The British finally, in the 1830s, found a good that they could produce quite easily, other than simply transporting New World silver, that would get them access to Chinese markets. This good was opium, produced in British territories in India. The British insisted that the Chinese accept opium and open their markets more generally. The Chinese government, weak now but still with some voice, resisted British demands, and the result was a conflict in which British and other Western troops easily overcame Chinese forces and pried open, at least began to pry open, this market both for opium, which was the widest selling single good in the 19th century world trade, and for European and Western activities more generally. Crisis number three. In 1853, an American fleet under Admiral Perry sailed into Edo Bay in Japan, Tokyo Bay, and demanded that the Japanese open their markets to Western goods. This was followed not only by another American expedition, but by a British expedition in 1854. And after considerable internal turmoil, the Japanese did indeed decide that they had no choice but to open, and indeed, in an unusually constructive reaction, would launch a process of reform that went well beyond simple response to Western demands. Crisis number four, 1854-5. The Russians had successfully achieved another territorial victory over the Ottomans and were poised to pry more Ottoman territory away. Britain and France objected for various reasons, including British fear about increasing Russian interference with British contacts with India, and Britain and France went to war against Russia in the Crimea, essentially literally in Russia's backyard. And although this was not an easy conflict, lots of losses on both sides, the West again won. The power of industrial production, industrial transportation, industrial technology applied to the military area now made it clear that even Russia was clearly behind. And then a series of military explosions and penetrations from the 1860s onward, particularly in Africa, also in additional areas of the Pacific, etc. There were few parts of the world that Europe tried to enter militarily where it failed. The leading one, ironically, was Afghanistan. For most parts of the world, either direct military penetration or the successful threat of this penetration now reshaped the world, at least again briefly, to the West's advantage. This was, of course, the century of imperialism, a familiar label, but it can be taken even more deeply. What happened fundamentally really was a simplification of the world economic patterns we've described previously. Two changes were crucial. One we've touched on already, and that was the intensification of the exploitation of the bulk of the world, not now just parts of the world, but the bulk of the world, by core societies, now increasingly including the United States. But the second change, and here's where the military part comes in, the second change was the effective elimination of externality. No major society could now stay external because the West, through military pressure, if not economic cajoling, simply wouldn't allow it. Thus, societies that had regulated Western contacts previously, like China, now found themselves incapable of maintaining this regulation. Societies that had sought partial isolation previously, like Japan and Korea, now find that they are not allowed to do this either. With a very, very small number of exceptions, the world is open to the Western-dominated world economy for a brief series of decades. In this framework, which really was, if you will, an intensification, a redefinition, but intensification of patterns that had already been sketched to some degree in the early modern period. In this framework, two or three other components get added in the long 19th century that need attention as well. First of all, this was, of course, at least the early part of the long 19th century, not only an age of early industrialization and its global impact, not only an age of new imperialistic military activities, but also an age of Atlantic revolutions. Beginning in the 1770s, a series of risings occurred in various parts of the Atlantic world, in North America, in parts of Western Europe, in Latin America, that would extend from the 1770s on to 1848-49, creating new political regimes, new attention to ideologies of liberty, legal and possibly even social and economic equality, a whole series of new ideological thrusts that brought important new political ideas and concrete illustrations of those ideas into the world stage. It isn't entirely easy to talk about how this other important initiative fully matches the larger framework that was shaped by industrialization and Western military dominance. Because frankly, many of the revolutionary ideals sincerely espoused by Europeans themselves didn't clearly fit the kinds of relationships that Europe was also forging with places in Asia and Africa. After all, if the new battle cry was freedom and political participation, imperialism was a denial of freedom, at least in many respects, and clearly a denial of political participation, so that there was a long lag on a global basis between the emergence of new revolutionary thrusts and truly global impact. Atlantic impact, quite clear, and this is an important aspect of the long 19th century. But global impact, in a way, would turn out to be greater in the 20th century than in the long 19th, because it's in the 20th century that various kinds of revolutionaries and reformers would utilize the ideologies of the revolutionary West or the revolutionary Atlantic world to help spur national independence movements, social revolutions, this sort of thing. So this is a category of developments in the long 19th century. We don't want to forget about it, and we will indeed see one clear impact in our next discussion of slavery and abolitionism, but it doesn't totally fit the patterns that we're indicating.